met them at their friend's house, I said to my husband, "You can go there if you want to, but I'm not going." Do you know what? We spent 7 of the happiest years of our lives right there. And if I had it to do over, I'd do it again. Lord, the Lord opened doors, and we were able to enjoy these people. It was in Martinsville, Virginia, and my goodness, how we love those people, and became a part of the school system and saw people develop and how the Lord used them. Moved on there to the First Baptist Church in Princeton, West Virginia. We were there in a World Missions Conference. And they didn't have a director of missions in West Virginia at that time. So we were a part of the Virginia Association, and my husband was asked to play the role of the director of missions. And we got all the missionaries coming in there, and we had to see that they got to their places, all of the things. This was kind of new for that area. And one day, as we were following the missionaries, Ann Dwyer from the Gaza Strip said, "Do you know, if you had to speak the language, learn a language, I could understand why you wouldn't want to go to the mission field. But," she said, "in Jerusalem, Jordan, in the land where our Lord ministered, there's English language churches, and there's no one to preach the gospel." Well, do you know, we heard it and we didn't hear it. That day, though, going home, and if those of you who got to know my husband, he's a quiet man. You understand why before the night's over. But he said to me going home out of Bluefield, West Virginia, he said, "Honey, how would you like to go to Jerusalem, Jordan?" And I thought he was being funny, and I said, "Suits me." But do you know, the Lord used that to get our attention. We began to pray about this thing and talk about this thing. And to make the long story short, as a Foreign Mission Board sent a representative at our request to our house to talk to us. But when he came, he said, someone has already taken the English language church in Jerusalem, Jordan. And then named 5 or 6 churches in the Orient that needed pastors. Well, we began to, I wasn't interested in that at first, but then the Lord wouldn't let it leave us as we began to pray about this matter. There's not time to tell you all the details of it, but we gave up the church and told the Lord, if this is where you want us to go, that we'll go to Japan. When we were in orientation, some of you have heard of a missionary by the name of Bertha Smith. She came to speak to us, those of us, there was 100 of us at Ridgecrest. We were the first 100 that went to Ridgecrest for that 4 months orientation. And she said this, pointing that finger like only Bertha can do. She said, crossing the water ain't gonna make you no missionary. And then she said, when you get on the other side, you find out you got sins that you didn't know you had. And I thought, Miss Bertha, now I know you an unclaimed jewel, and that might, now this is my thinking, but I'm married, I've got children, I couldn't imagine what kind of sin Miss Bertha was talking about that you was going to be confronted with on the mission field. But folks, we hadn't been there many months till I began to realize the craftiness of the devil. My husband, as we arrived there one cold January night in Tokyo, made our way through all of that small, narrow roads to the Chofu Baptist Church. That was Saturday night. On Sunday, he was installed as pastor of the Chofu Baptist Church. We became very busy. Over there, they drive on the wrong side of the road, and the steering wheel of the car is on the wrong side. And then they didn't at the time we were there can things like they do now. It was a problem to have to get groceries for your family because they eat the vegetables and things that are in season. It's different now, but when we got there, that's the way it was. And so there was lots of frustrations. Now the man who was pastoring this church was a Japanese who had learned, one of our missionaries who had learned had been working with the Japanese, had learned their language, but he was in between pastorates, and he had been filling in for 7 months for us to get to Japan. And so we were busy, and they put us in language school, but suddenly, one day, it dawned on me, Brother Ed is still here. We're going to call him Brother Ed tonight. I said, Brother Ed is still here. And my husband is pastor of the church. I never known us to have a church with 2 pastors before. Besides, it was a little church. And then, as I began to observe, everybody, my husband was not really the pastor. Always it would say, well, we need to ask Brother Ed. And then if we had a meeting, always somebody would say, well, let's see what Brother Ed thinks. And every time I turned around, somebody was talking about Brother Ed. And it began to eat, the little foxes. Why is it Brother Ed all the time? My husband's pastor of this church. See, I'd never had this problem before. And I began to deal with that thing. And so I decided I was going to help them get things straightened out. Who was the pastor? Now this is in my mind. So I began to invite the different groups to my home. I'd have the deacons to come, and you know what? I'd be in the kitchen fixing refreshments, and it'd be Brother Ed, Brother Ed. And I'd have a WMU group or the choir, anybody. And then another thing, Brother Ed was pretty good looking, and he could preach pretty good. And you know what? He had a sense of humor. He could be a clown in the pulpit. And if you know my husband, there's nothing like that about him. Very serious-minded. Every person is reverent. He is holy in his sight. And he has the greatest awe and the greatest respect for him. But Ed was always picking at somebody. And you'd hear a loud laughter down the hall, and you'd know Brother Ed was at it again. And this thing began to gnaw and to eat at me, and I thought, they said, now, Brother Ed, see, when we got there, they said, Brother Ed is going to be called by a Japanese church downtown, and then you will be able to pastor the church full time by yourself. But see, we taught those Japanese Western things. We taught them that you call a pastor in Japan like you do in the States. And so that Japanese church that needed a pastor didn't call Brother Ed, and he didn't have a place to go. And folks, only could you share this in a Baptist congregation. But you know what? Sometimes when committees do things that's none of their business, you get trouble going in churches. And the benevolence committee of our mission met, and because it would be another 4 or 5 months before the personnel committee met, they decided that Brother Ed ought to preach one sermon. He'd preach on Sunday morning, my husband preach on Sunday night, Ken have the prayer meeting service, then Brother Ed the next Sunday morning, and my husband the next Sunday night. You know what? You can't have 2 wives, you can't have 2 drivers, and you can't have 2 pastors. But nobody seemed to be letting that bother them but me. And I began to be concerned about that. And the more I seemed to do, the worse that it seemed to get. And I would come home, I would be exhausted, and there was a resistance. The little foxes had gone to work, and the resistance in me was building up. And suddenly, after years of teaching a Sunday school class, I was going into a Sunday school class. And do you know, I could teach the Sunday school lesson, I could prop it up with every illustration behind and before and in the middle, and still the Sunday school hour was not over. I had never finished teaching a Sunday school class before I left this country to go to Japan. And I didn't know what was the matter. I knew the girls wasn't interested. They'd sit and look like this. But you see, all this time, I was fighting an inner battle. I would go home from church on Sunday. I would be so exhausted from smiling and trying to be what I was supposed to be as a pastor's wife and just be wrung completely out because I was hurting so on the inside. And I'd tell my husband and he'd say, honey, let the Lord fight your battles. But you know what? I'd give it to the Lord and he wouldn't do nothing with it and I'd take it back. And you're the first group that's ever laughed at me in this telling this, and I don't. And I would struggle and struggle with this, and I finally, after a number of months, thought I can't stand this any longer. And I got mad at the Foreign Mission Board. I said, why did they send us out here if they didn't need us? If they got somebody to be the pastor of this church, why didn't they let us stay? I liked where I was in the beginning. And you know what? The Foreign Mission Board won't pay your way home the first time you go out. You have to pay your own way back. And so we didn't have the money to pay back my husband and my way. And besides, my husband wasn't talking about going. But the 3 boys and me couldn't have come back if we wanted to. We didn't have the money. And so I knew I was stuck. I had done everything I could do to make this thing work. For them to notice my husband. A 24-year-old young man came one night and said he wanted to talk to my husband and me. He came to our home and he said to my husband, what did you and Miss Bragg come over here for? And we looked at him and Ken very kindly said, well, we felt the Lord had called us to the mission field. And he said, we've got a pastor. We don't need y'all. This was a young man in the Air Force. And he said a lot of hurtful things. And see, nobody ever talked to me that way back here when I could have picked up the phone, called Mama and all my sisters and, a lot of people that you could call back here. Wasn't a soul out there to call. I didn't know any of the missionaries. We were new missionaries on the field. And if we had told somebody we were hurting,